So, in the Broncos franchise history, they've had one QB drafted that won them a playoff game. Can you guess who that quarterback is? Well, if you guess John Elway, you're wrong. He wasn't drafted by the Broncos. He was technically drafted by the Baltimore Colts, but didn't want to play there, so they traded him to the Denver Broncos. The guy that we're going to take a look at that is the only drafted quarterback by the Broncos to win a playoff game up to this point is Tim Tebow, the guy in Florida who had a unique playing style. He wasn't that great of a thrower, but for college football, he could make it work. And of course, he won 2 national championships with Florida, one as a starter. And in the NFL, though, people weren't too high on him. Yet in 2010, the Broncos took a flyer on him with the 22nd overall pick. He got a little bit of playing time in 2010, including making a miracle comeback against the Houston Texans for his first career win. But it was a year where the Broncos went 4-12 and were in the midst of a rebuild. They had fired Josh McDaniels. They're bringing in John Fox now. So Tebow must have got his chance in 2011, right? Well, not right away, as the Broncos and John Fox were still keen on starting Kyle Orton, a guy who at this point in his career showed that he was just kind of an average quarterback who could get the job done if you had the right pieces around him. But at this point, Brandon Marshall was gone. The Broncos didn't necessarily have a solid run game. They were kind of middle of the pack there. And the defense, which was once fierce in a year like 2005, where they went 13-3 and made the AFC Championship game, was one of the worst in the league. And of course, in the first 4 games of the year with Kyle Orton under the helm, the Broncos were 1-3, but their point totals weren't that bad. Outside of a 14-point outing against the Tennessee Titans, they were scoring over 20 points in a game. The problem was, again, outside of that Titans game where their defense allowed 17 points, their defense was giving up a lot of points. In a game against the Chargers in Week 5, trailing by multiple scores and Kyle Orton struggling, the Broncos decided to make the decision to go to Tim Tebow. And well, even though they lost that game, they almost came back and won as a 29-24 loss to the Chargers. Saw Tebow go 4 for 10 for 79 yards and a touchdown while also rushing for 38 and a TD. So, decent start considering he was a guy that came in the middle of the game with little to no preparation and almost led the comeback. And now they're going into their bye week and they have a chance to change things up, and that they did. However, it wasn't anything egregious. Like, if you remember in 2019, when the Ravens went into their bye week at 4-5 with Joe Flacco, he gets hurt. So now, during the bye week, they decide to scrap that whole playbook for rookie quarterback Lamar Jackson, and well, things looked great after that. The Ravens went 6-1. Their offense was moving the ball. Their defense was playing at a high level. With the Broncos, it didn't really seem like that, but let's just say the wins came in the most unusual ways possible. Heading into Week 7, the 1-4 Denver Broncos were taking on the winless Miami Dolphins in Miami. How do you think this game went? Well, late in the 4th quarter, the Dolphins were up 15-0. It did not look like the Broncos were going to be able to muster up anything at all, but welcome to Tebow Mania. 2 touchdowns, an onside kick, and a 2-point conversion later, the Broncos tie the game, go to overtime, and wouldn't you know it, win the game. A game where Tim Tebow did actually play pretty well. 13-27 for 161 yards with 2 touchdowns, along with 69 rushing yards. The next week, they were at home taking on the Detroit Lions, who, at this point in time, the Lions were good. They were on their way to making their first playoff appearance in over 12 years. And, well, let's just say this game, the Broncos didn't have any magic. They lost 45-10. Tim Tebow threw it 39 times. It wasn't great at all. In Week 9, the Broncos actually won by 14 points. This was the only game during this season that the Broncos won where it was by 2 scores. Now, they were trailing early in this game and came back, but there really wasn't any, heart attack moments for Broncos fans. It was like, they got it, they put the game away, and it was fine. And again, Tim Tebow was solid, but you start to see the pattern here is that Tim Tebow wasn't necessarily playing great football. He was just elevating. But the next game that I'm about to talk about, the next game is one of the more rare occasions we see nowadays where a quarterback did the bare minimum and the team still came out and won the game, as I am talking about a game in Kansas City where the Broncos at 3-5 needed a win to keep things going. And well, they won this game 17-10, so why is it so infamous if the game wasn't necessarily that great? It's just kind of like an average NFL score. The Broncos won this game in spite of Tim Tebow going 2 out of 8 for 69 yards passing. One of those being a long 56-yard touchdown to Eric Decker. Now, he also had 43 rushing yards and the other touchdown rushing, but the fact that they won this game with Tim Tebow doing that, the only other occasion I can remember where a quarterback finished the game with less than 5 completions was in 2021 when Mac Jones of the Patriots went 2 for 3 for 19 yards in a win over the Bills, but there was an excuse in that game. The wind was blistering and trying to throw the ball was pretty much out of the picture. In this one, it was just the fact of, I guess the Broncos were just playing game control and wanted to run the ball because they ran for 244 yards. But 2 out of 8 for 69 yards and a TD. Just imagine if teams were winning games like this back then. But sometimes the NFL is weird. And hey, you know what? The Broncos were winning, so no one was fully questioning it at the time. Because now they had a short week, though, to figure things out as they were playing Thursday night, Tim Tebow's primetime debut, one of just 2 primetime games the Broncos had all year. The only other one they had was Monday night, week 1, against the Raiders, where they lost. They are playing the New York Jets, led by Mark Sanchez. So we have Mark Sanchez versus Tim Tebow. Yay! Tebow worked his magic again with the team down 13-10 in a game where he was only 9 of 20 for 104 yards passing. He ran for 68 yards and what would be the game-winning touchdown. And now all of a sudden, the Broncos went from 1-4 to a 500 ball club at 5-5. And this year, the AFC West was very weak that they were now sitting in first place. The next week against the Chargers, they won the game 16-13 overtime. But then comes Tim Tebow's, I think, magnum opus game where he kind of, played well in this one despite, not necessarily having the best stats of his career. But if you've seen his passing stats that I've been reading off, they haven't been great. They've been under 50%. He's been making big plays here and there, but a lot of the time it's toward the end of the game when he's making play with his arm and legs. But throughout this whole game, he didn't really run the ball that well. He had 4 carries for 13 yards, which would be one of his lowest totals of the season. So that must mean he threw the ball a lot. Well, he didn't even really throw the ball a lot either. He threw it 15 times, but the big difference was he completed 10 of those 15 passes for over 200 yards with 2 touchdowns and no interceptions. And against a bad Vikings team, the Broncos, had to go down to the wire, but just like they have the past couple of weeks, won it 35-32 because that's just what Tim Tebow does. And now sitting at 7-5, the Broncos start to control their own destiny. Then came the Chicago Bears game, and this is where I think things started to take a turn for the worst for Tim Tebow and the Denver Broncos, because in this game, this was the only game this year Tim Tebow threw it 40 times in a game, and just one of 2 times he threw it over 30. But the thing is, the Broncos weren't doing anything offensively again. The defense was stepping up in this case, but somehow, some way, game went to overtime after Matt Prater kicked a game-tying 59-yard field goal, and then he would kick a game winner in overtime there to win the game 13-10, propelling the Broncos to 8-5. But the reason I say that this is the beginning of the downfall for the Tim Tebow Broncos is because things would get a little bit shaky after this. They had a highly anticipated matchup against Bill Belichick, Tom Brady, and the Patriots in Denver the next week, and although they got out to a 16-7 lead, the Patriots won this game 41-23, as even though Tebow played well in hindsight, the Patriots just weren't going to let him do his thing. Then they played the Buffalo Bills the next week, a team that was 5-9 entering this game and on a 7-game losing streak, and, well, the Bills won 40-14 because, that's just football. But hey, the Broncos had the AFC West clinched, so they were going in as the 4 seed. They were going to get a home playoff game. So what did this mean going into Week 17? Well, they still played their starters, and again, let's just say that it was horrendous. Not for a defensive standpoint. The defense gave up just 7 points, but the offense put up 3 points, and Tim Tebow in this game was 6 of 22 for 60 yards with an interception in a 7-3 loss, meaning that the Broncos have now lost 3 straight, limp into the playoffs at 8-8, and although they're going to be at home against the Pittsburgh Steelers, they are underdogs. And one thing I want to point out too is from the Chargers game to the Bears game, Tim Tebow's touchdown to interception ratio was 10 touchdowns to 2 interceptions. That was one of the main reasons they were winning the games. He wasn't turning the ball over. But during that 3-game losing streak, he threw 2 touchdowns to 4 interceptions and had 2 multi-interception games, which is something he didn't have all that season. So, needless to say, there wasn't a lot of hope for the Broncos heading into the playoffs, but as Tim Tebow had done all year, he made a miracle happen. Early on, the Broncos were actually taking it to the Steelers. After the Steelers got 2 early field goals to go up 6-0, the Broncos put up 23 straight points, and all of a sudden it was 23-6, and you're thinking, oh, they might actually have a pretty comfortable win. But as the Steelers in the late 2000s and early 2010s did, when the game looked like it was going to be out of reach and be a blowout, Big Ben and the team came back to tie the game at 23, and we were heading to overtime. Now, this overtime was unique and different because this was the first overtime game with the new rules where the team that gets the ball first has to score a touchdown or else the other team would get possession. So this wasn't just, oh, the Broncos can go down, get into field goal range and win the game. They had to score a touchdown. So yeah, the Broncos won the toss, and they knew what they had to do, and well, they didn't want to waste any time. Now, I don't think this play was designed to score, but Tim Tebow threw a slant to Demaryius Thomas, rest in peace, who then just proceeded to take it 80 yards for a touchdown, and just like that, the Denver Broncos continued their magic onto the divisional round with a 29-23 win against the defending AFC champions.
The Broncos have been in 3 overtime games this year. They won them all. Got him at the 40. It's Thomas at the 50. Stiff arm got him free to the 30, to the 20. Thomas to the 10. Denver's going on to New England. They win it on the first play of overtime.
And Tim Tebow, for what it's worth, had a 300-yard game. Again, under 50% completion percentage at 10 of 21, but 316 yards, 2 TDs with 50 rushing yards and a rushing TD. He did this against a pretty elite Steeler defense that finished number 2 in the league that season. So now, who was the Denver Broncos opponent heading into the divisional round? Well, none other than the New England Patriots. Now, the thing with this was, though, when you looked at their first matchup, you said, well, the Broncos did get a 16-7 lead against the Patriots, so there might be some fight here. The only difference is, now they're playing in New England, not Denver. Keep in mind, Brady and Belichick, when they played in New England, it was a whole different story. They were almost unbeatable. And, well, they kept that trend going. As the last game of the Tim Tebow era, the Patriots whopped the Broncos 45-10, and after this season, John Fox, who never really wanted to start Tim Tebow in the first place, moved on from him. They traded him to the Jets, and Peyton Manning came in, and they had a nice successful 4-year run with him, which saw 2 Super Bowl appearances and a Super Bowl victory, whereas Tim Tebow, he was never really used right with the Jets, and after 2012, he kind of tried to bounce around the league a little bit, including attempting a comeback in 2021 as a tight end with the Jaguars, and who can forget his failed minor league baseball career. But outside of that, this was the upside in Tim Tebow's career. And it's not like it was that great either. I mean, the Broncos had a minus 81 point differential, and Tim Tebow's stats, I mean, it just makes you wonder how they got there. He completed 126 of 271 passes, which is only good for a completion percentage of 46.5 with 1,729 yards, so 123 yards a game and 12 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. Kyle Orton, who played in just 5 games that year, he would later leave the Broncos, had a 58.7 completion percentage with 979 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 7 picks, and 196 yards per game. So the offense was more efficient with Orton, but for whatever reason, the team just rallied around Tim Tebow as he had a league-leading 5 fourth-quarter comebacks, and of course his 7-4 record was what kept the Broncos going with him. They were winning games with him. He was 7-1 as a starter before that 3-game losing streak at the end of the year. But this Bronco team just goes to show you that sometimes to make the playoffs, it's better to be lucky than good. And we've seen some interesting playoff teams make the league. As a matter of fact, there's a team that's similar to this Bronco team that had a better record and a better quarterback, but weren't necessarily known to put games away. Look at the 2022 Minnesota Vikings. They went 13-4, but had a negative point differential because they found themselves in a lot of close games, and they would win a majority of those close games, but when they got to the playoffs, it got exposed, and they were one and done, as people were just, before the playoffs saying they're frauds, and of course, they were. This Bronco team was in that same kind of, realm where they weren't good, they just got lucky at the right times and were winning games, and when they lost, they just got absolutely demolished. So there you have it. That's it for me. Tell me in the comments below if you remember Tebow Mania and you actually thought that maybe the Broncos could make some noise in the postseason, or were you one of those people that were like, they might win the wild card round, but past that, they might not do much, because keep in mind, if they were to upset the Patriots, then they would have had to have taken on the Baltimore Ravens, who, when it came to quarterbacks like Tim Tebow, the Ravens would feast on them, and considering the Ravens had a top 3 defense that year, I could see it being the same outcome as the Ravens probably would have blown out the Broncos and would have gone to a Super Bowl and won it a year earlier. But again, I guess that's just a big what if in itself. But until then, that's it for me, and I will catch you all in the next one.